Alrighty, we are live. Good evening, everyone. My name is Seisha, and I'm the social media manager here at Charis Books and More, which is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore, and also of Charis Circle, which is the nonprofit programming arm. And tonight we are so excited to host Jake Barker for Sign of Change, bringing LGBTQ and deaf community, bridging LGBTQ and deaf community, which is a workshop in celebration of Deaf Awareness Month. Today, our presenter, Jake Barker, is a profoundly deaf educator, advocate, and founder of Sign of Change, where he teaches ASL and promotes inclusive communication. With a passion for accessibility and social justice, Jake leads workshops on LGBTQ identity, allyship, and the importance of qualified interpreters in community spaces. His work bridges gaps, fosters understandings, and empowers individuals to create more inclusive environments. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Jake. And for those of you tuning in online, I just wanted to remind you that you can leave questions for Jake in the chat box. He'll be doing a Q&A session towards the end of the event, and I will voice your questions for the audience and for Jake. And before I pass it on to Jake to get the presentation started, I, of course, want to thank Nat Skinner and Nikki Jackson for being our sign language interpreters for this evening. All right, Jake, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you all for coming and good evening. Thank you for coming to this workshop where we're combining LGBTQ and deaf identities together. My name is Jake Barker. This is my second name, like that. So what is this workshop really about? Well, first, I want to talk about the deaf culture and LGBTQ communities coming together, that intersectionality between those two identities. And also having like a basic ASL community structure and like access to that kind of language for effective communication strategies. And then the next is how to become an ally and what that looks like. We'll have some resources at the end and Q&A. So about 4 months ago, this sign change. Sign change, and trying to really connect that LGBTQ and sign together. I've been saying kind of types of events, at workshops, conferences, and really just having that point of advocacy for the community plus LGBTQ community as well. I'm trans. I came out about a year ago on the day today, April 30th. So this little trans here free. For access, I'm trying to create access for both the queer community and the deaf community. I really noticed really more access. So my vision is to have classes, workshops, conferences, and to really be able to communicate through both communities. Next. So Deaf Culture 101. So deaf culture. Typically, a deaf person uses ASL to communicate and really thrive through sign language. It's a visual communication system, and there's different ways of using it. It's not only just the deaf people that identify as deaf, but there's deaf blind community that uses tactile sign. There's hard of hearing communities that might use hearing aids. Maybe a deaf person who has a cochlear implant, they might sign and speak, or a deaf person is speaking for themselves, and maybe they don't have access to sign language until much later in life. So that's more often the case. A lot of people don't know sign language and aren't identified as a deaf person. But again, there's just like so many different identities that might fall under this deaf umbrella. They have like a range of hearing loss. They have a range of like hard hearing identity, what it means to be deaf. Maybe a hard hearing person later picks up sign, and sometimes a deaf person uses just like home signs that they use with their parents. the parents taught them like home science that they just use within the home, and it's not necessarily ASL, but it's a way that they're going to communicate with their children. And that kid will grows up and might have that same language. So yeah, it's a pretty diverse community, and we'll talk about the deaf identity a little bit more later. And so for me, I grew up mostly oral until about 7 years ago. And I really found my deaf identity. I went to Gallaudet University and learned signing there. So I was able to communicate and figure out really how I identify. I have a cochlear implant, but I don't use it anymore. So I am fully profoundly deaf. So what does the LGBTQ and deaf identity look like? What is that intersection? So both identities for me, I am a trans person and a deaf person. So putting those together, I have a few different identities as a person. I'm not just one thing. I'm not just a man or just a woman. I we have different identities. We have different intersections as humans. I can be deaf. I can be trans. I can be a professor, an advocate. I can be. I have different identities that really describe who I am. And when I have them together, what does that look like? That could be the intersection of my identity. So maybe, I sign, I speak. Same with, LGBTQ. They have different identities as well. Maybe there's gay, trans, lesbian, bi. You meet different people and go on different dates. You find that range. So like putting those ranges together. So misconceptions on deaf individuals within LGBTQ spaces. Go ahead and read this. So, one thing, people that you assume that you can't necessarily express your identity. So, like, what is the goal of your identity? What are these? Well, I'm deaf, or hard of hearing, or maybe I'm deaf blind, I use tactile, or maybe I'm hard of hearing, but I use a cochlear implant or hearing aids. So there's lots of different identities and variations in that regard. And then you have deaf and LGBTQ. Um, sometimes people will hide different parts of that identity. So maybe they'll say, "Oh, I'm just deaf," and hearing people will assume, "Oh, they're just deaf. They don't have these other identities, or maybe they just won't communicate with us, or give up on that communication and never learn those multiple identities." Maybe they assume that we read lips, and I'm just going to say, no, we don't read lips. A lot of hearing people, or not everyone reads lips. A lot of some people try, they can somewhat, but it's really difficult, especially in the hearing world, trying to like completely understand everyone they're reading lips. That's the challenge. Um, so a big another misconception: deaf can do anything. A lot of hearing people assume that deaf can't. Um, and really, deaf people can do anything. I mean, I'm proof of that. I'm a professor. I'm an advocate, a social worker. I have all these different credentials, and so many hearing people just kind of sweep that all under the rug and maybe not see me as for what I can be and what my potential is. So that's cool. Let's see. It can be a little bit difficult. Deaf people are often mainstreamed. Um, some deaf people go to a deaf school where they're signing. So sometimes they have programs that are mainstream or fully mainstream, so they go to hearing schools. So a lot of people are speaking, and they have to watch an interpreter and fight through that communication or read lips all day. So how do you do that? How do you navigate that? That can be really difficult for some people, and that can lead to language deprivation. And that's happening in a lot of children. Maybe there's some children that don't completely understand English. They see people speaking all the time and try to pick up reading lips, but their language is delayed. Their hearing is delayed. They can't hear anything sometimes, without their cochlear implants, without their technology. So there's a lot of judgment coming from hearing people. And They think that deaf people can't do anything. They can't read, they can't write, they can't, there's all these can'ts in the deaf community, but they can with the right advocacy, with the right supports. Coming in saying like, how can I help you? What do you need? What can I do for you? That type of communication, maybe writing back and forth or using our phones to text back and forth. So stereotypes, we all know that. Okay, so sorry, LGBT. Sorry, I missed that sign. You're good. Yeah. So LGBT people can be ignored and oppressed, and so can deaf people. So when you're deaf and you're LGBT, that's a stereotype. That's a label. You have two labels on top of you that are getting ignored. So people are saying, how can I communicate with you? I don't know. And then we just have communication breakdown. Um, so when you identify as, LGBTQ, sometimes you already feel like, hey, I don't belong here. And then you're also deaf on top of that. And how do I get into a community? Everybody's hearing. I'm the only one that is deaf. Where do I belong? And so that can be a big problem, like having those two identities come together as my identity. Those are, I'm trying to pull them together and make it successful. And right now I'm struggling a little bit. Different events, like where's our interpreter? There's no interpreters in some of these queer events that I'm trying to go to. And how do I communicate in these spaces? How do I have to read lips? Do I have to use my phone and text back and forth with people? I don't know. Most of the time, about 80%, I can understand what you're saying, but that's about it. I am watching your lips. I'm trying to catch all the words that you're saying. Did he say bathroom? But really, he just said room. I have to really work hard, and my brain is working about twice as harder than your average person who's just like listening, a hearing person that doesn't have to really work through that barrier. So I don't know if I'm right or wrong on my understanding. It feels like a guessing game sometimes. I'm not sure if I'm getting all the words right from what you're saying with your mouth. I can't lip read everything perfectly. So I have to really build that skill and work really hard. And most of the time, I'm exhausted. They call it, receptive fatigue. And I can get overwhelmed just constantly taking in that information and trying to figure out what people are saying visually.
So, breaking down barriers to accessibility. What I mean by that is how accessibility is important, you know, breaking down step by step how we can break down those barriers. So, it's more common than you think. Deaf people are often born into hearing families. 90% of deaf children are born into hearing families, in fact. And that's a statistic that's still prevalent to this day, which means that in addition to that, only 10% of hearing parents learn sign language. So out of that 90%, only 10%, 90% of parents do not learn sign language. They go to audiologists, doctors, and all these people tell, oh, well, you've got a surgery, you can give them a cochlear implant, we can get them hearing aids, speech therapy, train for 12 years to become, quote unquote, labeled as a hearing child. And while their identity really is deaf or hard of hearing or deaf blind, maybe Usher's syndrome, there's many different identities and ways to be. So often parents will go to doctors and say, well, what do I do with my child? And how do I communicate? And often doctors and audiologists will just go straight to speech therapy, cochlear implants, a way to fix them and make them be able to listen, which is not true. It's not true. So now I'm working on teaching how, well, I am an ASL teacher right now. So speech therapy is fine. If the child and the parents, they want that, that's something that they're looking for. If the child wants to rely on technology, if that's something that they'd like to try, to hear without assistive devices, it's important to give parents all the facts. But unfortunately, right now, it's more of a case where listening is better than signing is viewpoint, but really ASL and signing will help develop English. And when you don't rely on that, they don't develop English in the same way. And there's a way for them to both use receptive listening and signing, but often parents will go straight to relying on the advice from their audiologist instead of a deaf mentor or a deaf school. At deaf schools, it's a signing environment, and all interactions all day are done. Children and adults, teachers are using sign language for the classes, for the different subjects, and childs are understanding, that education at all times. But when it comes to deaf and hard of hearing children with cochlear implants, hearing aids, in mainstream schools, they often will miss a lot of content. And especially if there's no interpreter, there's no ASL interpreter, which oftentimes it's true, they'll miss a lot of the content or have to guess what's going on, how to fill out this worksheet. And, often they don't understand what's going on in the education, which will lead to, language deprivation, education deprivation. On the other hand, at deaf schools, there is education done accessibly where they can understand history, math classes, those different subjects, and they're able to communicate with their friends. But now deaf children are, sent to deaf schools and then sent home on the weekends where their parents and their family don't sign. And if the parents and families are not signing at all, that's obviously the case of when these kids come back home, or they're so excited, they're really desperate, they're looking for communication, and when they go back to school, they're back to normal. So they're always hungry for communication and that accessibility. So it does, happen very often that hearing people will overlook the deaf community and say, oh, well, I prefer my child to just become hearing. I prefer for them to just speak. I want them to have a cochlear implant so they can hear like us. And oftentimes it's something that parents will want instead of, and that's an impact that we have felt for many, many years, and we still feel today, which is why it's so important to do this work of trying to advocate for the community and bridge together these gaps and also break down these barriers with deaf mentors, deaf school, deaf events, and just start involving your deaf or hard of hearing or deaf blind family or child into events. If you could go to a drag show, that if they always have an ASL interpreter, we can go ahead and put one at the drag show to give deaf accessibility to enjoy the show. If you are deaf and use ASL, oftentimes we'll go to an event and we can enjoy it, but if I don't understand what's going on with the music, there's only so much that body language and that kind of communication can do, and interpreters do so much of that work to bridge the gap of showing the communication and the way that input is coming in. But without that, it just becomes overwhelming. You miss a lot of stuff that's going on. And if you're, trying to look around at different places to see what's going on, you often can't catch it all. When it comes to college, there's a lot of times where there's no interpreters, and deaf students will often have to fight very hard to get an interpreter for their classes, where the professor is just speaking in a big lecture hall, and it just becomes very overwhelming. It can become easy to miss a lot of information, and it becomes very tiring for deaf people to advocate for ourselves, for our entire lives. And often people feel they need to just give up and say, well, I don't want to go to this event because there's not going to be an interpreter, or how am I going to get an event for this event that I want to go? How am I going to get an interpreter for the event that I want to go to? you know, there's a deaf center, the Georgia Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, where you can request an interpreter through that agency, and interpreters, often will need to go, and you need to explain what are the interpreters for and how, they can be placed in the classroom and all the ways that they're involved in that way. So there's a lot of work required on deaf people have to do or forced to do to bridge this gap. And often deaf blind people are left out entirely. That's most cases that within the deaf community, deaf blind people are left out even more so. They can't see, they can't hear, and just having a tactile sign language interpreter involved in the event as well is another way to make sure that that group in the community can be involved. And there's deaf blind people that are LGBT and identify that way, and to have that, you would need a lot more communication than, even a standard deaf person who can see clearly. So we need to figure out how to include all of those aspects of the community. For example, I have a deafblind friend, and let's say that, I need to describe what the PowerPoint looks like. There's orange and black words on the screen. There's a design of a person lined up in the top corner. And then in the bottom left corner, it says 90% of deaf children are born into hearing families. So I'd have to explain, how small and big the words and the pictures are. Whereas a regular deaf or hard of hearing person can look and use, their vision to read the PowerPoint. So that's another way that, we can have just a wider understanding of these events and the needs that there might be. So breaking down barriers, what can we do to start breaking down barriers step by step? We can get deaf interpreters and hearing interpreters at events. So, okay, what do I mean by a deaf interpreter? So if there's a deaf person signing, a deaf interpreter will have more of a structured sign. They're more in tune with the visual needs of a deaf person, more body movement, facial expressions, signs that maybe can be converted more from English into full ASL grammar. Hearing person, hearing interpreter will, interpret what's coming next the way that, we have interpreters now that are interpreting my signs into English. But a deaf interpreter has more of a control of ASL, a more in-depth structure fully in their arsenal. And you can also break down barriers by captioning your social media, for example, your Instagram posts, Facebook, I guess Twitter or different, Instagram social media apps. Start captioning your videos, for the deaf community. If you're trying to promote something like an event, or you really just want to include deaf people, start captioning. Auto transcript, or also you can transcript, describe what you're wearing, where you're sitting, if you're standing. So for example, if I'm signing, I'll say, well, I'm Jake, I'm wearing a black blazer, I'm wearing brown pants, and I've got a blue collared shirt with a button up, I've got brown short hair and blue glasses. There's a way that you can type a transcript, a visual description. That way, a deaf-blind person who, will be viewing that will understand, oh, also I'm wearing red shoes. But that kind of identification will help deaf-blind people access, I'll say, I'm a man, or, just those kinds of things where you're captioning more information on your social media. So that way it's clear, you're understood, your audience knows exactly, what you're talking about and what they're looking for. Hiring deaf LGBTQ consultants or leaders. So for workshops or events, or if you're having an ASL class, hire a deaf person. Make sure you're keeping us in mind. Somebody that knows sign. Hearing people obviously can learn sign, but when it comes to teaching it, hearing people are encouraged to use it to communicate, but not to teach, because a queer or a deaf person can change the structure, the grammar, and talk about the culture and the history. And so keeping us in mind when you're hiring for those kinds of things. You can also practice visual accessibility. So by that, I mean, making sure that the lighting is looking good. Obviously, we were doing that before this, changing the lighting around, making sure that it's clear on the recording. Do I look blurry? Am I too dark? Do I need to move or stay where I'm standing? There's some work that needs to be done to figure out those things, just to make sure that everything is visually clear, to make sure that you're lit enough, but not too much, so that it's easy to see each other. When you're in a face-to-face situation, you can make sure that you're making eye contact, facing each other, so there's just a clear field of vision. Okay. So that's, how we can start breaking down those barriers in different spaces. And sometimes you can't, in some spaces. There's just, you need to figure out or come up with a new game plan. right? If there was no lights here, I would have to maybe move closer or move into the field of the projector. Maybe the interpreters would have to move to another location. If, we didn't have, I'm just coming up with, different situations. You kind of have to make it up on the spot and make up a new game plan and try your best to do that, to figure out how to make the space accommodating for me, for the interpreters, for the audience to see me clearly, or there's a lot of different things that come into play with that. So figuring out how to make sure that the space has enough space for deaf people to see. Sometimes deaf people like to go ahead and get in front so they can see the signs clearer. Interpreters can be off to the side so that they can be seen clearly as well. So it really does depend on the space that you're at, how big the event is, how small the workshop is. There's many different types of gatherings and events, and you have to face each one as its own and see, okay, so like a deaf person is coming, let's say it's a drag show or it's a drag bingo. There's anything. It could be a lube wrestling event. And, there's many different ways that you can be in a space and figure out how to make it work the best. Who's speaking, where are they standing, what's going on with that? Is it a concert? So it's important to just make sure that that space is a way that can be seen by all. All right. So ASL basics and communication strategies. What I mean by that with communication strategies is how you can interact with, a deaf blind or a hard of hearing group or a person. And, sometimes there's places where people don't know sign and they prefer speaking. And you can approach someone and ask, do you prefer to use ASL? Do you prefer to speak for yourself? What is your preferred mode of communication? So it's always best to ask somebody their preferred mode of communication before you kind of jump in and start signing. And sometimes people will be like, well, I have no idea what you're talking about. Let's back it up. And so, asking someone their communication preference is always a good idea. It'll make them feel like, finally somebody is recognizing and asking me what my preferred mode of communication is, instead of just assuming, because a lot of people will just assume, well, I don't know ASL, so I don't know. And that's fine. It's fine. We can write back and forth on our phones. We can write back and forth on a piece of paper. So I just want to go ahead and give you guys an idea of, what some signs look like. Obviously, you see me signing now, but I don't know if all of it's going over your head because I'm signing so quickly and just, that's my way of signing. But some basics are more like things like hello. So it's like a B handshake, hello. Yeah, just hello. This one here is, let's say you're working, I'm just, I guess, coming up with, like, let's say you work in a restaurant, like a coffee shop or a restaurant or a bookstore, and you need like a name. Just go ahead, sign this. Name what? Name what? So what is your name? So that's a way that you can, or also, for example, at a restaurant, you can ask for, well, what is your name? Or what is your coffee order? What's your name? And you can go ahead, you put that down on the cup, obviously, when you go to a coffee shop.
So I know this third one, it's a little weird, but writing, you can ask, hey, do you write? Do you want to write back and forth? That's a way of, asking someone for their communication. We can write on paper, or you can also use your phone, maybe in the Notepad app, where you can just like text back and forth and have a little conversation there. So you can say, for example, I would like a latte, and what kind of books do you like, and we can go back and forth with that kind of conversation. Specific conversations. You don't have to have the signs for them, because sometimes that can be a little niche, but you can just write back and forth on your phone. Most of the time, deaf people are ready. They have their phones out and they're ready to go because they already know that most people don't know sign. There's some people they meet that say like, "Oh, I know a little bit of sign," and that's really relieving. But then you start signing, and they're like, "No, don't go too fast. Slow down. I don't understand." So that's okay. But if you could try to prefer to sign, or would you prefer to text? And they typically said, "Let's just text back and forth." So you know we can try to sign, and if it's not very proficient, if the hearing person isn't very proficient in sign, they might say slow down, slow down, slow down, because it's going to be too fast. So it sometimes you got to take a couple steps back and go real slow. Hi, my name is Jake. You get it? No. Okay, let's try it again. My name is Jake. Got it. Okay, perfect. Because it takes time for your brain to really process when you're taking in that like receptive language and not hearing voice. It's a skill you have to build, and eventually you can get there. Next, thank you. So that's a sign for thank you. For thank you for coming, thank you for showing up to the coffee shop, thank you. You know. Next one, bathroom. It's pretty simple. It's like, where's the bathroom? I have to go to the bathroom. It's right over there. So yeah, that's how you'd say, where is the bathroom? Next one is please. So like, please, could you say that again? Can we write that down? What exactly are you looking for? Maybe like text it to me, please. Do you need anything else? Oh, please slow down. I don't understand. This is kind of like a basic ways to use it. Did the lights just go out? Sorry. I'm sorry. I thought the whole lights were going out. All right. So typically deaf people will pay attention to the lights, because we switch lights on and off to like get each other's attention. But anyway, so that's how you would use please, or use that sign, or you could say, hey, please, let's write again. So how would you get a deaf person's attention? First, you could use the lights, like I just said. You saw how I was just kind of was a little jolted by that light going out for a second. So lights, you can flip the lights up and off and on. You can always tap somebody on the shoulder. You can walk up to somebody. If you try to scream their name, it's not really going to work because we couldn't hear. Maybe they're fully deaf. Maybe they're hard of hearing. It really depends. So it's always appropriate to just tap somebody on the shoulder. Um, Sometimes you can wave to try to get somebody's attention, especially if there's an emergency and a deaf person can't hear and they can't hear. Just wave, jump, do whatever you need to do. You can stomp on the ground. Sometimes that makes a vibration through the floors and get their attention. Do not throw things at people. That's happened so many times. If somebody has thrown something at me and it just goes right over my head. Nah, don't do that. I mean, unless you're good buddies with like hearing people and you're friends with a deaf person, like I'd throw one at Nikki for sure. But but trying to throw something at a deaf person to get their attention, just please don't. Always tap, or like a small wave, stomping on the floor also works sometimes. There's different ways that are appropriate. The lights again, or your phone flashlight, you can just wave that as well. I just had to get creative. Sometimes it's dark outside and you can't see me, so I'll use the flashlight. Always include ASL interpreters. For example, at events, if you have deaf colleagues at work and you're in a workspace, hard of hearing colleagues that communicate in ASL, if you're at an agency or organization, you should provide interpreters, and just start doing that now, because some people are communication starved, and they're so exhausted trying to advocate for themselves, and are maybe uncomfortable or awkward. I don't know if my boss understands me. I don't know if they know where I'm coming from. So please start including those just little things, and it'll go a long way. I mean, don't try to do everything and fix it all in the moment right now, but just start trying to bridge some of those gaps. And it might take a couple tries, but eventually it'll work. So accessibility for lights again, for the space, it depends on where you're at. If it's really dark, or if it's too bright, or how many people are in a small space, or do you have enough room to sign? Does a person signing have space to communicate? Because some people use like bigger space, bigger area, just to clarify. So just clarifying on how to interact with the deaf people, and how often people will say like, oh, deaf people can see everything. That's not the case. We can't see everything. So often, if I'm sitting and I'm looking up and I can read something on the PowerPoint maybe, and then I have to look at the interpreter, and maybe I don't understand the English that's on the PowerPoint, and then I have to ask somebody like, what does that mean? And so often we'll have to ask to clarify, be like, hey, what does this mean? What did they say? I don't understand this concept. So always explain and clarify, and really just figure out how to connect to that person for and that's just how to building that communication and filling in those gaps that you might have culturally and understanding. And then now we're going to talk about language deprivation. So language deprivation typically means that people are missing pieces. Maybe the child is 2 to about 15. They miss that whole piece of learning English and speaking and socializing and hearing, and they might not understand what's going on in the world, what's happening. Parents are talking, teachers are talking, and they never had that access to communication. And then later they start to learn, maybe like at 15 years old, they go to deaf high school, and they start picking up some signs, and it becomes their natural language. But they missed that whole piece, that that gap of education from like 2 to 15. So they have to relearn a lot of things that they missed from that early childhood, that time frame. So, for example, if they say this person is missing, 2 years old until 18, maybe they're missing language. They had no interpreters in schools, for example, no ASL communication. They didn't have anything growing up. And then they go to college for the first time. They're at Gallaudet University. It's a deaf university. So they get in there and they're learning sign, and they start to learn that natural language for them, and they start to understand education for the first time. So, because they missed elementary school, middle school, high school, and sure, they've picked up a few things here and there. They know how to write, they know how to read, maybe speak a little bit for themselves. And hearing people often assume that hard of hearing people that speak can hear. And like, sure, yeah, but also they're missing a lot of communication. There's a lot of gaps in what they're able to take in. So when this person is, 18 and they go into college and they start signing and it becomes a natural language for them, and they start learning that sign language, they feel free. They've finally freed themselves. So now that intersectionality of identity and LGBTQ, maybe they won't find out that second piece of their identity until much later. So maybe a person was born and they have deaf parents. And so the deaf parents teach the kid how to sign growing up, and they already have their identity early because they have that access to language. But then hearing families, they don't really know how to teach. They have like different ways of teaching their kids, the teaching the cultural identities and what types of labels. The kids does not have to get to label themselves until they become an adult, or maybe like 16, 17, 18, and then finally they have some identity for themselves instead of having these labels just attached to them. So that intersectionality of LGBTQ identity and deafness, how does that come together? I didn't get it until much later, and that's just kind of how that starts to work. I had to accept that I was a deaf person, and then finally, okay, I'm deaf. Well, I'm also trans, and had to understand that. And that was my little two pieces of intersectionality that came to my identity. And then there's also people who are deafblind, or different types of cultures that they're raised in, and then starting to learn. But a lot of people start to learn those extra or added identities much later. And it's that interaction, that socializing, that meeting people that are similar to you. A lot of hearing people don't meet deaf people until much later. Maybe they're like 18, 19. But now, if they're in a deaf program at school, they have a deaf group of children that are maybe in a program that are at the hearing schools, and they start meeting each other. And so those deaf and hearing worlds kind of blend, and they have connections, and they have the little groups that go into different classes, and they're interacting with each other. And that happens often, like about 90% of the time. When kids are mainstreamed, they don't have an interpreter, no deaf friends, and they're all hearing people around them. And all these deaf kids are so used to people telling them what to do and then teaching them different things, and they're all like speaking the whole time, and they're able to have friends, I guess, but it's mostly just a lot of isolation. And that isolation happens because no communication. They don't learn ASL, they don't have a language for themselves, they don't have a way to bond with their family, they feel like they're missing a lot of pieces, holidays with the families. They have dinner table syndrome where all the parents are talking over each other and the kid just wants to know what's happening. And all they get is, oh, we'll tell you later. And that's what happens often with parents of deaf kids. And they think, oh, it's not important. Oh, it's nothing. Or maybe their friends think, that it's not important either. Or you'll say like, hey, what was just happening? Oh, it's not important. You don't need to know. Yes, they do. The kids need to know what they're saying, or the deaf people need to know what's happening. So that's what's important to have interpreters. So, maybe if they're, playing games at holidays or, with your families, you want to start including those deaf family members. Maybe there's a prize they'll win or something that it's fun. And, maybe start with like at your events, like if you start getting interpreters, or if you have somebody who's deaf who says, I want to meet the drag queen at the drag show, say, all right, come on, let's go, and really start including deaf people in these events in different ways. And maybe you have to text back and forth for that, but once you start doing that, you'll realize, oh, the deaf people don't have to be left alone. But that's often the case. Deaf, blind, hard of hearing, they're always by themselves. There's a lot of isolation. So instead, maybe approaching them, saying, hey, do you need anything? You need help? You want to be involved with our game? Like, come on. We're going to watch the drag show. You want to come with us? That kind of stuff. Is that communication? Maybe you just like are using your phone in the notes app, or maybe you're using a piece of paper to write back and forth instead of just leaving people in that isolation. I mean, deaf people are already lost in a lot of isolation, but if you invite them to the table, that's even better. Instead of maybe the deaf person will show up to the event and maybe leave early because they, don't really understand anything, they don't feel included, and they'll just dip out. So instead, approaching these people and intentionally including them and breaking down these barriers. Maybe start yourself by taking some basic ASL classes, just ASL1, ASL2 classes, learning how to fingerspell, and start to build that rapport with deaf people and deaf culture and start getting involved. And the more you take classes, the more it grows. And then that bridge is then filled up. Those gaps are eliminated. That kind of communication will thrive, and then the queer community will have a better allyship with the deaf community. And that's how you become a better ally together. And hey, come on, say like, let's go. I know a little bit of sign, let's interact with each other. Let's be friends. You can teach me some more sign. I've learned a little bit on my own. You know, I've learned a little bit. Come to my event. And then the communities will start inviting each other to each other's events, and then you will have that connection and that true allyship, and then it works eventually with work and with time. And both groups, I think, will be much happier with kind of communication. I've met so many people that say, oh, I've always wanted to learn sign. Well, come on. And, some people are like, how do I interact with deaf people? How do I get invited to events? Let's do it. Start involving yourself and involving other deaf people. Let's get ready and like wanting to get involved more. We have to be ready for that. Deaf people are ready for that connection. So we just need to start. We're ready. Are y'all ready? Let's come on. Let's get together.
Okay, so now I'll take any comments or questions. Do we have any questions here? Oh, and also, if the people that are in the chat online, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat.
We do have a question from someone online. Jen G asks, Jen G says, I identify as a lesbian and know basic ASL and live in Gwinnett County. How and where can I get involved in the deaf and LGBT community where I live?
Yeah, you said, where are they from?
Gwinnett County.
Oh yeah, let me get Nikki to spell that again. I'm sorry, I'm still learning about Georgia. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not super familiar with the area. I'm not from here. But
it's like a suburb of Atlanta.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So would you mind saying the question one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Um, Gen G identifies as a lesbian, knows basic ASL, and lives in Gwinnett County, which is a suburb of Atlanta, like 45 minutes out. How and where can Gen get involved in deaf and LGBT communities where they live?
Yeah, I would love to learn more about your area. Like I said, I'm still pretty new to Georgia, so I still need some more time. But a way to get involved in the deaf community is to, if you want somebody to teach ASL, go ahead and like ask me. I mean, I'm happy to help with setting up deaf events, setting up maybe a deaf coffee chat. If you know any deaf people in the area who maybe know how to sign or people that want to learn how to sign, get them together and, connect with me. I'd be happy to set up some kind of event. Sign of change. Eventually, my goal with it is to be nationwide. So that is something that I'm looking to do, covering all of Georgia first. Myself, I'm from Tennessee. I'm from Knoxville originally. So I'm trying to set up services in Tennessee, in Georgia, all over the nation. So, please just reach out to me. I mean, I would love to talk more with you about how to get involved and how to set up some things in your area specifically. Definitely. As hopefully that answered your question.
I live in Gwinnett County too, and your class is the closest to me. So if that helps.
Yes. Yeah, I think I got it. Thank you.
I think we've got one more question back here. I saw a hand. Oh, no one wants to fess up to the hand. That's fine. I have a question. Jake, me, Seisha, I and Charis overall, we are an organization that frequently has interpreters and provides like interpretation at our events. But we have discussed in the past that it feels like harder for us to reach deaf community, and this might be a larger conversation where we take you up on your consulting services. But what are different ways that people who are queer and plan queer events can reach deaf people to let them know that hey, our events are interpreted, and we would love for you to come.
Yeah, so I think always start promoting, events as accessible for all. That would include the deaf community, deaf people with an ASL interpreter. You can always promote it through different organizations like I know here it's the Georgia Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, GCDHH. You can maybe talk to them and say, hi, we have an event. Like, we like to promote it. We have ASL inclusivity. And maybe they can help with reaching out to people that are deaf and also identify as LGBTQ and finding a way to promote that out to more deaf people. Like, there's Facebook pages, you know, just letting people know in those spaces, like, well, we have an interpreter that's already going to be there. And there could be some deaf people that are, maybe hesitant or scared because sometimes, interpreters don't show up, things happen. And if they show up and, well, there's no interpreter after all, if something happened or, you know, it can happen commonly, but it's always a good idea to give it a chance to build that bond. If they know that you're going to be providing interpreters continually, they're most likely to go ahead and attend.
Got it. Well, you'll probably be hearing from us. Folks online are asking how does Sign of Change have a website, or how else can we reach you?
Yes, so the website is in development at this moment. I just recently started this organization up about 3 months ago. So I am in the middle of developing a website, but for now, you can contact me through email, and I'd be happy also to provide business cards. I've got some today that I can give out to you all in person, but contact me by email. We have a Facebook page. I have an Instagram set up, so you can always reach out that way as well.
What's your email? I'll type it in the chat for the folks.
Yes, so it is sign of change 2025 at gmail.com. Yeah, so the year 2025 at gmail.com. Yeah, so sign of change 2025 at gmail.com.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And is that also your Instagram?
Yes, my Instagram is also signs of change 2025. Yes. You will see the logo. Can we go back maybe in the presentation? Show it to you again. Yeah, all the way. Yes. So that's my logo. If you see that picture, that's my Instagram and my Facebook as well. And then yeah, if you can go back to where we were in the presentation, a little bit more. Oh, there we go. One more. Do one more. Perfect. Yes. Oh, there we go. Look, I already included it. There we go.
Thank you, Saish. We talked a lot about what members of the hearing community, whether or not in the queer community as well, can do to be helpful. Is there anything in that you found in your personal interactions where hearing people are trying to be helpful, but it's not necessarily doing what they're hoping to? So kind of a watch out for that. You think that's helpful, but it's actually not.
Yeah, so sometimes there can be miscommunication, of course, for deaf people, with the topic of, I guess, helping. Some deaf people feel like they don't need help per se, but I think if you look at it more of a way of how can we work together, or, because sometimes deaf people can get offended by that idea. It personally, it doesn't offend me, but there are some people that are, sensitive and offended easily and are tired of like, oh, I don't need help. I don't need help. You don't need to help me. So yeah, I think looking at it from a perspective more of like, well, how can I provide accessibility for you? Or how can we work together to find an accommodation for you and not like a way to help you? Does that answer your question? Great.
We've got a
I have a similar question to this, but I'm trying with a group of students to start an ASL club. Um, and we know a little bit of sign, but we can't start teaching people because we don't know any about it now. So I was wondering if maybe, like, some ways where it's a bigger city I can get involved. I've tried reaching out to the Georgia Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I haven't heard back from them yet, but I was wondering maybe there's a way for actually to deaf people and kind of build connections to start.
Yeah. So often, and I mean, right now you're correct. There's not a lot of events that are happening currently. There definitely has been a kind of breakdown in that lately. So my goal is also to set up more events with my business. So that would be things like Deaf Coffee Chat, where we all come together in the Atlanta area, and I will try to set it up obviously in different areas as well. But of course, obviously the strongest amount of deaf communities in Alpharetta, Tucker, Decatur. There's a bigger number of the people in the community in those areas. So yeah, I think you can definitely follow. There's a Facebook page called Deaf of North Metro Atlanta. You can maybe make a post there saying, "Hey, I'm like a ASL student. I'm trying to get involved in events." They sometimes will host Deaf Night Out, which is open for all people that are ASL students, maybe people that don't sign super well but want to learn more. It's always a very open, welcoming space for the most part, and so that's a good way to kind of do that more. And that's based on my knowledge. Like I said, I'm still learning the Georgia area, but I believe they're in Alpharetta and that kind of area. So yeah, you can reach out to me as well for some more information with that. I would love to support you in starting that up. I also do provide ASL teaching services at Georgia State University. So if you need help with trying to figure out how to support, we can do something with GSU as well. Does that answer your question?
We've got two more questions online for now.
Sure.
Robin says, "Hello, I'm a CODA and learning ASL. I am writing my master's thesis on radical accessibility in museums. Anything that goes beyond compliance, which we all know ADA could be improved. I'm wondering if you have any particular experiences in museums or libraries, aquariums, zoos that you were impressed with in regards to accessibility. Was there anything that you have seen that made it obvious that they were trying but didn't include deaf people in the conversation before implementing?"
Yes. So I have experience, going into museums or aquariums, and honestly, often there's a lot of places that just don't know how to provide accessibility, and yeah, excuse me, but hearing people can be a little bit closed-minded, can be a little bit daft sometimes, and maybe don't know how to communicate or when it comes to ADA law, there is a lot of flexibility, honestly, where people will be like, oh, well, we don't need to provide an interpreter because, that's not following the ADA law exactly. But, that does count as discrimination. And that is autism as well to, enact that impression, that oppression and kind of discrimination against the deaf community. So often, if that happens at museums or aquariums, I think libraries, there's some libraries that are better than others, and some are just completely clueless. But there's been times where libraries have had, interpreters for what's it called? An event where you do like a story. Yeah, like where if there's a library day and you're reading a story and you can have someone signing there, maybe you can have an ASL day. Yes, thank you, Nikki. Yes, story time, doing a story time, including an interpreter, someone that's signing there would be better. So that's something that I think, could be done if you contact your local library and say, can we maybe organize something with an interpreter or some kind of signing event? Because that will help, just to ask too, if you can also ask somebody like, well, how can we support with interpreters for this event? And yeah, I have experienced that in the past, definitely where I've showed up and there's no interpreters at all, and I have to kind of ask, and they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, we forgot to send an email and request the interpreter," and that's just frustrating. So, deaf people are very used to having to follow up again and again. But it'd be great if hearing people could take on a little bit of that and make sure that they follow up successfully. That was a good question. Thank you.
And then Kenley asks, could you go over any LGBTQ specific signs?
Yes, sure. Yeah, that's no problem at all. So first, let me think. Oh, 1 second. Okay. Yeah, I lost it. Sorry, I thought I was gonna sneeze. So let's start with trans. Trans. Oh.
Jake, could you move forward a little so the camera can catch you a little bit better? Like right in front of your screen and then 2 steps up. 2 steps up from where you are. Up, forward. Like towards me. Towards me. Is the light too bright?
Can we turn off the projector? We can go ahead and turn it off,
Oh, you can try that.
or just close the laptop.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. Oh,
Am I right in the camera? Are we good?
Yeah. Can you just move like in the middle of the white screen so people can see a little bit? Yeah, perfect. Yes.
And this is my personality, by the way. I'm funny, I'm a little bit goofy, but anyway. So trans. Here's a sign for trans. Lesbian, right here. Gay, you just have to spell it Gay. Non-binary is NB. They say I'm NB. Spell it like that. What else? Oh, queer. Sorry, I had to think about it. Queer. Like a rainbow. Yeah, queer. So you can just say like, "Hey, I'm queer," and make a little rainbow sign like this. What else? Cis. You got to spell CIS. Straight. Thank you, Jordan. Straight. um, there's those are a couple of them. Oh, LGBTQ can be done like this. I know it's a little weird, but so we got queer and then we got LGBTQ.
instead of like spelling out LGBTQ plus blah blah blah. It's just LGBTQ. Intersex. Okay, sorry, I'm still learning about Georgia signs. I'm from Tennessee. I've learned from Washington D.C., so I'm just picking it up in different places. I was in D.C. for 5 years, then I moved back home and I learned Tennessee signs, and now I'm here in Georgia and I'm learning Georgia signs. Oh, these signs are different. My interpreter signs is different from me. I got to be like, what? Teach me. Yeah. Yeah. So, if you say I identify, and then you just add whatever queer, trans, lesbian, gay, non binary, and pronouns, you could just say he, his, them, or he, they, or whatever. He, again, we're spelling these, all finger spelling. Any more questions? I still got a little bit of time.
We do have one more. Kenley, we've got a lot of like museum people online. This is very cool. But Kenley asks, beyond interpreters, is there accessibility things to consider in day-to-day operations of museums that could improve deaf people's experiences?
Do you mind do you mind expanding on that question a little bit more?
Well,
do you mean like for a tour, or do you mean like all day, or like interpreting like stories in the museum, or what do you mean? What
got
exactly?
it. Yeah, we'll wait for Kenley to respond, but Robin told us why there's museum folks online, because Robin and Kenley run a startup trans museum together, which is very cool.
Cool. Love that. All right, where's your museum at?
Yeah, we need Kenley and Robin. We need more information on this, and also expanding on your question so Jake can answer it more thoroughly. But while we wait, is there anyone in our in-person audience that has a question?
Don't be afraid to ask me anything. I won't bite.
So, my daughter is dyslexic, and she's dyslexic in English and Spanish, and we've tried other languages. It hasn't worked. So we've had to fight the school to let her take ASL as her world language. And that will start next year. She has actually picked up some things pretty quickly. But is there any, we've been using apps. I don't know if that's good or not. I'm learning with her so that she has someone to practice with. But is there anything that you would recommend until she can start her class? And they will be virtual. I guess they will have a teacher. We're not sure.
So I provide ASL classes. So I do virtual and face-to-face classes if you're interested for your daughter to start learning maybe before she falls into the actual courses. Also, the app. One app I would recommend is called Lingvago. There's a lot of different deaf instructors that teach you through the app. And it's good. It's a good app to start learning different signs. You start off in the basics, like colors, like red, book, food, what do you want, those types of things. Some good signs on the app, and then eventually it progresses until for higher levels, and it also has games that you can play on it to help you learn. And there's a lot of children or kids with like autism, dyslexia, or communication issues of any kinds. They can learn ASL, and I've noticed I've met several people that pick up ASL very quickly that might have other learning disabilities, and it's kind of like art, like it's expressive. And ASL, they could just pick it up easier. So I don't know. It's also a good way to communicate with the parents too. So maybe that app kind of builds that communication. You're welcome.
Jake, because I know you, I need you to promote your classes a little bit more. I need you to tell the people how they can reach you. tell the people how they can reach you and how they can take your classes.
Okay, so so I'm promoting my ASL 1 class, and that starts on Tuesdays. It just started yesterday. However, I am still accepting students. It is, not too late to start. So if you're interested and you want to sign up for my class, my virtual class on Tuesdays, reach out, get involved with Sign. Come on. Also, I have partnered with Kiss and Red, Kiss and Red, Ride, Kiss and Ride. Thank you. And I teach classes face to face there on Fridays, and you still have time to sign up for that. I think it's from 11 to 1. But I'm also trying to strategize, try to find when people can take classes in the evenings or in the mornings, on the weekends, which ones are best for people. So I'm still trying to figure out how to move that schedule around. And I'm always open to hear your feedback. If you prefer one-on-one, if you prefer certain days of the week, just contact me. You can do one-on-one. If you prefer group, that's fine. We can set up a group. We can have workshops. We can do things for your business, at your museums, whatever you need. And we can set up those classes and partner together.
Thank you. Robin did respond with more information about their museum. Robin said, "We started the California Aggregation for Gender Diversity. We're based in the San Francisco Bay Area. They're a nonprofit organization that exists to build community, provide resources, and educate the public on transgender, genderqueer, intersex, and non-binary topics through mainly history and art programming." And yeah, I guess if y'all want more information and more assistance from Jake on making your events accessible, definitely reach out through the email that I dropped earlier, signofchange2025@gmail.com. And for anyone that's looking for a talented deaf ASL teacher, you can also reach out to Jake through that email or find Sign of Change on Instagram. Do we have any more questions for Jake tonight?
I'm a corporate social responsibility manager and also head the diversity and inclusion council for my company. And we have several employee resource groups, one of which is an LGBTQ resource group. And I would love for you to come speak if you were interested, and let's connect afterwards. Okay.
Absolutely, let's connect. Works.
Also, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the city of Atlanta is doing a feasibility study for an LGBTQ community center, and I would love to put you in contact with that committee so that they could include the deaf and hard of hearing community in their plans.
Yeah, I'm ready. Get involved. Let's go. Make that change. That's what I do. Sign of change. I'm ready to make the change. Yes.
Hell yeah. Okay, so we did get clarification from Kenley, and I actually think it's a really interesting question because they're asking, outside of having an interpreter, is there anything about the infrastructure of the building, the way things are displayed, or any other operations that can make a museum more deaf friendly?
So it all depends on the structure of the building, and I would have to look at it myself. I haven't really been to the museum before, but that's when I can come in and kind of check it out and see what the structure looks like, see if the space is big enough, so that we have sometimes the interpreters will ask the deaf client, like, "Hey, is this space good for you? Can you see my facial expressions? Can you see my signs?" So often we have to be way far away, or sometimes we have to be really up close. So those kind of questions, typically the interpreter would ask and the deaf person would do that. So, we have to advocate for that. And sometimes if it's not working out, we have to move to another location or move to a different area so we can see the speaker and the interpreter at the same time. If you notice why my interpreters are wearing black, it's visual. I can see them. So I can see them clearer. It's same with online. You can see the people when we sign, it's more clear. We have that contrast with our hands. So if it's a small space or if it's a big structure, big space, I don't know if it's going to be a good area for an interpreter. If there's like history being explained by a tour guide or somebody. Sometimes people have to come to the front or like shift through a crowd of people to be able to see the interpreter or see the tour guide. And so it really just depends on the structure of the building. How big, how small it is. If you don't mind, I would come look at your building. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. Well, we'll definitely give them room. Once again, if y'all want to hire Jake for consulting services, oh, they said thank you. If you wanna hire Jake for consulting services, or inquire more into their ASL teaching, you can find Jake at signofchange2025@gmail.com or on Instagram at signofchange2025. And Kenley responded, "It's a start, and we have a lot of work to do."
Well, thank you. Thank you guys all for coming out to the workshop. I'm ready to get involved and like really make some change. So thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it.
And thank you, Jake, for leading this incredible workshop today. Thank you for sharing your experiences. And I think everyone is leaving here with a lot more knowledge than they came in with and a lot more ideas of how to make our spaces more accessible. I also wanted to thank Nat and Nikki for interpreting tonight. And yeah, thanks again, Jake. This was incredible.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.